Hi, this is Kevin Gruich. I'm here to show off the final custom feature I'm adding to my engine, following up on last week adding controller support, and this week I was adding bindings to multiple input types. So I'll go over just a quick overview of what's actually added in the C code, and that's sort of these functions here, right? So you can get an action instead of getting directly stuff like, is this key down, is the mouse button being clicked, is a controller button being clicked, these things down here. Instead, you can just directly ask, give me the input, right, give me the action. Say my action is, shoot, give me what the action is of shoot currently, and you're able to set all the inputs to that action directly. And so you can have multiple different inputs that are all retrieved at the same time, right? You can be having a key input, a mouse input, a controller input, and an axis input as well. So that can be like pulling the trigger or moving the thumbstick and such. And so all those are activatable onto the same input. And possibly you can actually have multiple of the same type as well. It's pretty expansive. And as an extra thing, I did add touchpad support. This isn't really a part of the bindings because it sort of just works entirely differently, right? This is sort of similar to how getting the mouse position doesn't make sense to bind it, right? Like getting the XY where the mouse is doesn't really help much, but you can get the XY of the touchpad and such. Actually, I can even just show off the touchpad support right now. Let me turn on my camera for the controllers. There we go. And we'll run the game. And so the way it's currently set up in my Lua script for it is that, and right, touchpad controller, it will get the first, so it's actually able to detect two different fingers on the PS5 touchpad sensor. I don't know the general standard for sensors. It actually allows itself as much as the hardware says it's able to handle. So if you have a controller that's able to handle 5 fingers independently detected, then so can the engine. But in terms of this, we can support 2, and we set it up so that we detect the first finger as X, and then we use the second finger as Y. And then by doing so, you can actually move the character on the screen. And the character is set to be invincible for the sake of the demonstrations, but I'll just show it off.
Mission start!
So you see moving the X, and then we can move the Y here, and then in combination, we can move the character. And obviously here in the log, you can see all the actual raw data. So obviously it's a relatively obtuse way of controlling it with the 2 separate fingers, but it's just sort of showing off the different finger detection abilities. But on the input binding side of things, so you're able to set the action name, then you send in the input type, and you're able to say if you want, obviously you have the keyboard, mouse, controller, and axes, but you're able to say whether you want them to be just down if you want. So that would be not just detecting, is it down currently, but was it pressed down on this frame? Or was it just let up on this frame? So you can set to those specifically if you want, and that's available for both, mouse, keyboard, controller. But yeah, so all those are options, and we just use string inputs and we convert it in, and then we also just get the input name. And so then we have some extra options here that are optional, which are actually set through the Lua options. Initially, I thought I would have to make separate functions for it, but I was able to play around a little bit with the Lua interface to allow for optional arguments using a wrapping function for it, because out of the box, Lua does not support optional arguments. So the player ID, that refers to the fact that you can have global actions, basically whether or not an action is, if it's done on one controller, whether that should just apply no matter what to what you're doing, or if it has to be done on a specific player's controller. So you can say this is, if it's -1, it's everything. So that could be like a pause menu or something like that, right? If anyone's hitting the pause menu, we're still going to the same pause menu no matter what. Everyone has the ability to pause. But if you're, say, designing an asymmetric game, different players are going to have very different control schemes. And to track those different inputs, it's much easier to say, get player ID 2 and that will only trigger this thing. And so that's what that supports. And then the axis threshold is for if you're setting an axis, setting specifically, you're able to set where it triggers on that. And then related to that is setting whether or not you want to use the dead zone or not. Because by default, right, there's the dead zone on the controller, which is set by, can be set in the Lua. There is a function for that. Right here, set dead zone int and set dead zone float. So both of those work fine for it. The reason why it's int float is because in terms of how the SDL handles it, it's actually an int directly, but I just offered support to set for both ways. But by default, it's enabled, and so if you want to ignore the dead zone, you can just set that to false, and you're able to set very hair trigger levels of precision for it. But obviously, there's a reason dead zones exist for reasons like stick drift and such. Okay, and that's most of it, right? Obviously, we have other functions for just removing the input bindings if you want, and you can actually toggle whether or not you want action group to be used. So say if you have all these different binds set up, but you say, okay, they're using the controller, we want to turn off the keyboard, you can do that if you want. And we have a demonstration of that later. Okay, and that covers most of it, I believe. Obviously, there's more C code in other places, but this is where all the high-level stuff is done in this file. Okay, so looking at the Lua, let's go to action control. We can see that we have several different bindings. So these are all done right on start, and you can just set them then. And so, for example, we have up on the keyboard, right, and we just set it to the WSAD keys and the arrow keys simultaneously, because that is supported. You can have multiple of different, of the same input type of different buttons if you want. Then we also set it to use the controller D-pad. Actually, that one is for later. We can use the controller D-pad, and we can also use the controller axes, all simultaneously, right? Of whatever you want to be testing, whatever you want to use. And so all of these work like that. You can just set them up one time, and then you can just do input get action right. Whatever you called the action, you can just get it, and it'll return true if any of the statements you set for it are returning true. And then over in this class here for controlling the character for shooting, we set a couple keybinds for it, or a couple bindings as well. So we have controller down A. This is to just show off the fact that you can actually map different actions to the same key, right? So because we already mapped A over in action control, we already mapped A to left, we can simultaneously map it to shooting as well, and we'll show that. And then we can map controller button down A to shooting as well, and then we can set the trigger. And we have two versions of the trigger. First, we're going to show off the one with the standard dead zone usage. Okay, so let's show that. Actually, this is
mission start.
Okay, so you see right here we can use the D-pad, that works fine. You can use the stick, you can use right trigger to start shooting, yeah, right there. And you can see we can shoot with X as well here, right? And then getting away from that, you can move to the keyboard here, and I can press WASD, right, and move around, and you see as I hold A, we're shooting simultaneously, right? And then we can switch the arrow keys as well. So all of that works simultaneously. You set it once, and it'll be able to check for it on every frame. So if we go back into the Lua, we switch out some of those commands for some of the other types you can use, right? So instead of using the dead zone, we set the dead zone to false. Using the dead zone on this specific command to false. And we set it to a very small float, so it should trigger extremely easily to shooting. And then over in the action controller here for the movement, we can put in some extra stuff, right? So we can go ahead and say we don't want player 2 using the D-pad if they were inputting. We can instead allow that to only be used on player 1, right? So once we get that set up, then that means that I can show on player 2 attempting to input on the D-pad will actually do nothing. I mean, it'll register the input, but that's fine. Okay, We run it again.
Mission start.
Here we're on player 1, and we're using the D-pad. Works perfectly. We go to player 2. We start using the D-pad, and it does nothing. Alright, and then we can show the very light trigger pull. See, like, it's extremely light, and that's because we said not to use the dead zone and to use a very low float. So that shows that, and then one last feature to show. Right, if we undo the player restrictions real quick, we can then also just toggle off an input type whenever we want, right? So obviously it doesn't need to be done at start. This could be done mid-script, but this will turn off the usage of the controller buttons, which is the D-pad in this case, for the right movement. So we gotta switch this one back to.
Mission start.
So move around. Everything else is normal, right? But D-pad right, see, doesn't move. D-pad up, down, and bottom will, but D-pad right doesn't work. Obviously the axis still works fine. Keyboard works fine. It only deactivates that one method of input for that action. Alright, well that's the long and short of it. It's highly modular, and it can all be set pretty easily with just a single function, and it all adds and I think becomes pretty easy to retrieve and use. Obviously needs documentation so they know what they can input, and I am working on a serialization for it, for allowing saving and loading different binding maps, but that's a lot longer of a process than anticipated. Alright, thank you.